Elena had never been the kind of woman who drew attention when she walked into a room. She was quiet, she kept her head down, she worked harder than anyone around her, and expected nothing in return. For as long as she could remember, that had been her life, simple, invisible, and steady. She washed dishes in the Alpha King's great hall, mended the warriors' torn clothing before dawn, and disappeared into the background like a shadow that nobody noticed unless the light hit it at just the right angle. She had grown up without parents. The pack had taken her in out of obligation, not love. She had no rank, no bloodline that anyone knew of, and no one who would stand up for her if things went wrong. She understood this about her life. She had made peace with it, or at least, she had learned to tell herself she had. The Blood Moon ceremony happened once every generation. It was the most important night in wolf society, a sacred gathering where bonds were confirmed, alliances were sealed, and the ancient traditions were honored under the full moon. Every pack leader, from every territory came. Warriors stood in their finest. Elders sat in seats carved from stone that had been there for centuries. The great hall burned with firelight, and for one night, the world felt ancient and powerful and full of meaning. Elena had not planned to be there. She was supposed to be in the back, refilling water pitchers and staying out of everyone's way. But something happened that night that she could not explain and could not stop. A pull, a warmth that started somewhere deep in her chest and spread outward like sunlight through a curtain. Her feet moved before her mind gave them permission. She set down the pitcher she was holding. She walked forward through the crowd, and people stepped aside without knowing why. She stopped in the center of the hall, and then she saw him. Alpha King Kaidan stood on the raised platform at the front of the room. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that made a room feel smaller just by him being in it. His dark eyes swept across the gathered crowd with the calm certainty of a man who had never once doubted his own authority. He wore no crown. He did not need one. Everyone in the room already knew exactly who he was. His eyes found Elena. The bond hit them both at the same moment. Elena felt it like a warm wave washing over her entire body, a recognition so deep it was almost painful. She had heard the elders describe the mate bond before, that undeniable pull between two souls that the universe itself had chosen for each other. She had never believed it would happen to her. She had never thought she was the kind of person the universe paid attention to. But Kaidan did not look moved. He looked at her the way someone looks at a mistake. He stepped down from the platform slowly, and the crowd parted for him just as it always did. He walked toward Elena, and for one breathless moment, she thought everything was going to be different. She thought that maybe tonight, her life would change in the way that stories changed, suddenly, beautifully, without warning. He stopped in front of her. He looked her over, her rough, work-worn hands, her plain dress that had been washed so many times the color had faded, her eyes that were still and clear and waiting. And then, in front of every alpha, every elder, every warrior and pack member gathered in that hall, he said the words, "I reject you." His voice was calm, almost bored. He said it the way a person says something they have rehearsed, something they are certain about before the moment even arrives. He said that she was beneath him, that a king could not stand beside someone with no name, no bloodline, and no rank. That the bond, whatever it was, meant nothing to him. That she should go back to where she came from, and be grateful she had been allowed into the hall at all. People in the crowd laughed softly. Others looked away, embarrassed, not for Kaidan, but for her. A few whispered behind their hands. Nobody stepped forward. Nobody said a word in her defense, because nobody ever had, and tonight was no different. Elena stood completely still. She did not cry. She did not argue. She did not beg, and she did not break. She simply stood there for a moment, with her eyes steady and her breathing calm, absorbing what had just happened, the way a tree absorbs a storm, bending slightly, but not falling. Then she nodded once, very quietly, as though she were accepting something that had always been true, and had finally just been spoken aloud. She turned to leave, and that was when the air in the room changed. It was subtle at first, a low vibration, almost too deep to hear, that moved through the stone floor beneath everyone's feet. The firelight did not flicker. No wind came through the windows. But something shifted, something invisible and immense. like the moment before a storm, when the birds go silent and the air holds its breath. The ancient wolves felt it first. There were 7 of them in the hall that night, wolves who had lived for more than a century, who remembered the old world before kings had territories and maps had borders. They sat in the carved stone seats at the back of the room, their white hair and silver eyes marking them as something different from everyone else. They were called the Firstborn. They did not bow to anyone. They had not bowed in a very long time. The oldest of them was a woman named Maren. She was small and thin, with white hair that fell past her waist and eyes the color of winter sky. She had not shifted into wolf form in over 40 years. She sat still in her seat most evenings, watching the world with the calm patience of someone who had seen so many things that very little surprised her anymore. Maren inhaled slowly. Her eyes, which had been half closed with the easy stillness of great age, opened fully. She turned her head and looked at Elena's back, at the young woman who was quietly walking toward the exit, with her shoulders straight and her hands folded in front of her. Maren's expression was impossible to read. Then, without a word, she stood up. The room noticed. When Maren stood, people paid attention. She walked forward through the crowd, which parted for her immediately, and stopped in the center of the hall, the same center where Elena had stood moments ago, where the rejection had taken place. Then Maren lowered herself. It was a full bow, head to the ground, hands flat on the stone floor, in the formal posture of deep reverence that wolf tradition reserved for only one thing, the divine bloodline, the ancient line that most people believed had vanished from the world 300 years ago. One by one, the other 6 firstborn rose from their seats. One by one they walked forward. One by one, they lowered themselves to the ground in the same bow. Then others followed, not the young warriors, not the pack leaders, but every wolf in the room who carried ancient blood, every elder who had lived long enough to carry the memory of the old traditions in their bones. They dropped to the floor in silence, like water finding its level, like something falling naturally into place after a long time of being out of order. Elena heard it, the soft sound of knees meeting stone. She stopped walking. She stood with her back to the room for a moment, and then she turned around. The hall was half on the ground. She looked at the bowed heads, at the firelight catching the silver in the firstborn's hair, at the stone floor, covered with people who had never bowed to anything in their very long lives. Her face did not show triumph. It showed something quieter and more complicated than that, something that looked like grief mixed with wonder, like someone who had just been handed a very heavy and very precious thing they were not sure they were ready to carry. Maren's voice rose from the ground. She did not address Elena by name. She used a title instead, one that every ancient wolf in the room recognized instantly, and that the younger wolves had only ever heard in old stories told around fires on cold nights. The unmarked queen. The words fell into the silence of the hall like a stone into still water. Maren spoke carefully, from her bow, explaining what the prophecy had always said, that the divine bloodline would not announce itself with power or wealth or visible strength, that it would carry no mark of any pack, no crest, no recognizable claim, that it would be found among the invisible, among those the world had overlooked and passed by, and sent to wash dishes in the back of great halls, and that when the time came, the firstborn would know, not because they were told, not because of a ceremony or a crown, but because something in the oldest part of their nature, something that lived below thought and language, would simply recognize what was standing in front of them. The way every cell in a body knows the difference between light and dark without needing to be taught. Caden stood on the platform and said nothing. He watched the hall in silence, the bowed elders, the kneeling firstborn, the ripple of recognition moving through people who had been present for the most important moment of the century, and were only now understanding what they had witnessed. His face was very still. The rejection he had spoken out loud minutes ago still hung in the air, and it meant something different now than it had when he said it. He had not rejected a kitchen worker. He had not dismissed someone beneath him. He had looked at the center of everything his world was built around, and turned away from it by choice, in public, in front of everyone. Elena stood in the center of the hall and looked at the room around her. She looked at the bowed wolves, at the people who were only now beginning to understand. at the king who was standing very still on a platform that suddenly seemed much less elevated than it had before. She was afraid. She would not pretend otherwise, even to herself. She could feel the weight of what this meant pressing down on her from all sides. The responsibility, the history, the expectation, the life she had lived until tonight, dissolving behind her like morning frost. She looked at Maren, still bowed on the stone floor, and asked the only question that mattered to her in that moment. Was there ever a choice? Maren lifted her head just slightly, enough to be heard clearly. There is always a choice, she said. That is precisely why it had to be you. Elena was quiet for a long moment. She understood what that meant. Someone who had been given comfort and rank and praise all their life might have accepted this role with ease, because they were already used to being the center of things. But someone who had lived invisible, who had been told she was nothing, who had survived every morning by simply choosing to get up and keep going, that person knew something different. That person knew that power was not something the world handed you. It was something you chose, quietly, every single day, even when no one was watching. Especially when no one was watching. She looked at Caden one last time. Not with anger, not with the satisfaction of someone who had been proven right. She looked at him the way you look at a door that has just closed, noting it, understanding it, and walking in a different direction. Then she turned and walked out of the hall. The great doors opened before her without anyone touching them. The night air met her like a hand placed gently on her shoulder. She stepped out onto the mountain ridge, and the full blood moon hung enormous and white above her, and the wind moved through the tall grass at the edge of the ridge, and the world stretched out in every direction farther than she could see. She stood there alone for a long time. Inside the hall, not a single firstborn had risen. The ancient wolves remained bowed on the stone floor, waiting, not because they had to, but because some things are worth waiting for. Some arrivals take a moment to settle. Some people need a breath of night air and a look at the sky before they are ready to step into who they are. Elena closed her eyes. She felt the moon on her face and the wind on her hands, her rough, work-worn hands that had scrubbed floors and carried heavy things for as long as she could remember. She thought about every morning she had gotten up before sunrise, every meal she had prepared for people who did not know her name, every night she had gone to sleep in a small room with a small window, telling herself that this was enough, that she did not need more, that invisible was safe. She thought about the word he had spoken, rejected. And she realized, standing on that ridge under that moon, that the word had always belonged to her more than it had ever belonged to him. She had been rejecting herself for years, quietly, daily, in 100 small ways. She had been the first one to decide she was not enough. He had simply said out loud what she had been whispering to herself for a very long time, and she was done whispering it. She opened her eyes. The world looked exactly the same as it always had. The mountain was still the mountain. The moon was still the moon. The wind still moved the grass at the edge of the ridge, with the same soft sound it always made. But something inside her had shifted, something quiet and permanent, the way the ground shifts after a long winter, when the first real warmth comes through, and the earth slowly, slowly begins to open. She was not the same woman who had walked into that hall carrying a water pitcher. She was not the same woman who had stood still and absorbed a public rejection without blinking. She was still quiet. She was still unassuming. She still did not need a crowd, or a crown, or anyone's permission. But she was no longer invisible. She turned back toward the hall, and took one step forward, and then another, and the blood moon lit the path before her with a light that was clear and steady and very, very old.